This lecture is an introduction to the plant body. We'll start by introducing you to some of the features of the plant cell. Then we'll take a look at plant tissues, both the meristematic and the adult plant tissues. Within the adult tissues, we'll take a look separately at the dermal, ground, and vascular tissues. Then we'll take a look at the functions of each of the plant organs. The plant organs include the leaf, the stem, and the root. And then finally, we'll take a closer look at the functions of the two plant organ systems, which are the shoot system and the root system. Okay, so starting out by looking at the plant cells. First of all, before we talk specifically about the features of plant cells, it's important that you know that cells in general are the structural and functional unit of all life forms. So they're crucial to understanding biology. When I say that cells are the structural unit of life, what I mean is that the cell builds the organism. So kind of like bricks laid down in rows build a brick wall or a building, cells build organisms. So they are the structural unit of life. So whether we're talking about plants, animals, or single-celled organisms like bacteria, their bodies are made up of cells. Cells are also the functional unit of life, and what I mean by that is that these cells are little chemical factories where many of the important biochemical reactions that sustain the body of the organism are happening. So they're both the structural and functional unit of life for all life forms. We're going to be focusing on the structure and function of the eukaryotic cell because plants are made out of eukaryotic cells. The other kinds of cells are called prokaryotic cells. Those are the kinds of cells that single-celled organisms such as archaeans and bacteria are made out of. But plants and animals and fungi and many single-celled organisms like algae are made out of eukaryotic cells. These cells are larger in size than prokaryotic cells. They contain genetic material called DNA inside a nucleus. So there's a little compartment of the cell called the nucleus that's housing the DNA in eukaryotic cells. And then they also include lots of little membrane-bound sacs or organelles where specialized chemistry can take place. So we'll take a look at some of these organelles and we'll take a closer look at the nucleus of the plant cell in just a minute. But I want you to know that plant cells are examples of eukaryotic cells. And in this picture, what we see here is a micrograph that was hand-drawn by Robert Hooke in his book Micrographia. And this was the first time that most people on the planet got to see cells. So this is a drawing of plant cells, specifically their cork cells. So cork cells are the cells in the bark of plants. So the outside of stems that are undergoing secondary growth, we have these bark cells. And this is where he coined the term cells. So he thought that the cork looked like the monks' quarters in a monastery, the cells. And so that's where we got the name cells. Other biologists around the world started noticing that it wasn't just bark that was made out of cells. It wasn't just cork. It was everything. And that's when we started to understand how important cells were to biology. Okay, So now we're going to take a closer look at some of the features, the unique features and not so unique features of plant cells. So like other eukaryotic cells, so fungal cells and animal cells, plant cells have a nucleus. And we can see that nucleus in blue here in this diagram. The nucleus contains and protects the DNA, and DNA is the blueprint for the organism. So this is the genetic code that the organism received from its parents. This is the hereditary material that includes the plan for the organism. It's present in all cells. DNA is present in all cells, although this little sac, the nucleus that contains it, is only going to be present in eukaryotic cells. The DNA is so crucial because it includes the directions for making proteins. So those proteins are going to determine what this cell does and what this cell looks like. So proteins are really the workhorses of cells. The directions for those workhorses are in the DNA, which is why this serves as a blueprint. DNA is also the hereditary material of life, so it includes the genetic material that parents pass on to their offspring. So this blueprint in the eukaryotic cell, like plant cells, is contained within the nucleus. The central vacuole, or as it's called in this diagram, the permanent vacuole, is a unique feature of plant cells. As you can see, it's a really large part of the plant cell. Some cells, it contains up to 90% of the volume of the cell. So it's a really dominant component of a plant cell. It has a couple of different functions. The central vacuole can serve the plant cell by isolating, and it can be a place where the plant can kind of dispose of waste or debris or potentially toxic materials. So it's kind of like a little dump in some senses. So if there are things like salts or other toxic compounds in the cytoplasm of the cell, that's sort of this white goo on the outside of the vacuole, they can get transported into the vacuole where they won't interfere with the chemistry that's going on in the cytoplasm. The central vacuole also helps the cell maintain its size and its shape. So you've probably seen plants wilting before, especially herbaceous plants, like maybe impatiens. If you have impatiens planted outside of your house, if you don't water them, they start to wilt. So they get really flaccid and limp. That's because the vacuole has lost water. So the cell has gotten dehydrated because you haven't watered the roots. And when this vacuole starts to shrink in size, the cell's shape is no longer supported and wilting occurs. So when the plant has plenty of water, the vacuole is large in size and it's helping to fill out the shape of the cell. And it's also creating a pressure called turgor pressure that makes plants like carrots and celery crispy. It's crispy because those cells are just bursting with water, and that water is mostly being stored inside the central vacuole. So it's got a couple of functions. The central vacuole has a couple of functions for the plant cell. Another feature of the plant cell that distinguishes it from animal cells is the fact that plant cells have a rigid cell wall. It's permeable, so stuff can get in and out of plant cells, but it's really rigid. It's made of this tough carbohydrate called cellulose, so it's these really long chains of sugars. That's what cellulose is. And it's a tough material. So it's part of the reason why plant cells are able to maintain these rigid square shapes. So a lot of times when you see plant cells, they're drawn like little squares, whereas animal cells they lack walls. They're more like water balloons, and they have a shape that can change a little bit more and is certainly less rigid in its structure. So this tough, rigid structure, the cell wall, surrounds the plasma membrane, and it helps to protect the plant cell. Another unique feature of plant cells is their chloroplasts, which are shown in this diagram in green. So they're these little green discs. They're green because they contain light-absorbing pigments such as chlorophyll. And those pigments are extremely important to the function of these organelles, which is to conduct photosynthesis. So chloroplasts are going to be concentrated in the leaf cells, and we'll talk a little bit more about leaves later. These are the main photosynthetic organs of the plants. Photosynthesis is an extremely important set of chemical reactions to plants. And I've summarized this set of reactions below with this equation. So you need to know this equation inside and outside and forwards and backwards because it is so important to plants. In photosynthesis, plants are taking water, which they're getting from their roots in the soil. They're taking carbon dioxide, which they're sucking out of the atmosphere. This diagram down here it looks like a little sandwich. This is a little section of a plant leaf. You can see they've got these little holes called stomata or stoma usually on the lower, but sometimes on the upper surface of the leaf. That's how they're getting this carbon dioxide. So they're sucking it in through these little pores. And that's how the chloroplasts, which you can see are the little green discs in these leaf cells, are going to gain that crucial component of photosynthesis through the stoma. So the water is going to come up from the roots, the carbon dioxide is going to come in through the pores in the leaf, and then the leaves are going to intercept sunlight as long as the sun is shining and the plant isn't being shaded by something. So those are the three things that the plant needs in order to conduct photosynthesis. They need water, they need CO2, and they need sunlight. From these simple raw materials, plants can make carbohydrates. So they make their own food. These carbohydrates can be broken down so that the plant cell has energy. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Or they can be used for building material. For example, the cellulose in the cell wall that we just looked at is made up of strings of carbohydrates. So this is a really important raw material for plants, these carbohydrates that they're making through photosynthesis. The other product of photosynthesis, oxygen, is a waste product that the plants release through these same pores, through the stomata. So you should be familiar with the chloroplasts and know that they're mostly located in leaf cells, plant leaf cells. You should know that these organelles are the site of photosynthesis, which is crucial to plant cells. Photosynthesis is how they make carbohydrates from water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. And those carbohydrates are what feed them and also how they build their bodies. Okay, plant cells also have organelles called mitochondria. So here you can see a single mitochondrion in purple. So they're these smaller disc-shaped organelles. And unlike chloroplasts, animal cells, like your cells, also have mitochondria. These are crucial organelles because they're the site of aerobic respiration, and this is how plants get their energy. So we talked about photosynthesis. You need to know that that's how plants make carbohydrates, but the energy in those carbohydrates needs to be transferred into another form before it can be utilized by the plant cell. So aerobic respiration is a series of chemical reactions that plants undergo in order to harvest the energy that's in that food. So you need to also know this formula. This is the basic inputs and outputs of aerobic respiration. You need to know it inside, outwards, forwards, backwards, just like the formula for photosynthesis that we just looked at. So this is an amazing process where organisms like plants and animals take carbohydrates, like the carbohydrate glucose, which can be made from the products of photosynthesis, in the presence of oxygen, which plants are getting from the atmosphere. You're getting that from the atmosphere to conduct aerobic respiration too. That's the function of your lungs, to take that oxygen and then distribute it around your body through your blood cells. Plants are getting that oxygen through the stomata in the leaves. In the process of aerobic respiration, this carbohydrate is being broken down in the presence of oxygen to water, carbon dioxide, and both of these are byproducts. They're not really what the organism is looking for. In your case, the CO2 that's produced in aerobic respiration, you exhale, so you don't use it. Plants could possibly use that CO2 for photosynthesis, but the really important thing that is being generated from aerobic respiration is a molecule that's abbreviated with 3 letters, ATP. This is the cell's energy currency. So this is what the cell is burning up to move things, to push chemical reactions, to get stuff into the cell, to get stuff out of the cell. It's spending this ATP. So the food that the plants make is energy rich, but in order to actually do something with that energy, they have to convert it to ATP. That's what's going on in the mitochondria, aerobic respiration. Okay, so I want you to be familiar with the features of plant cells that we just talked about, including the cell wall, the central vacuole, the mitochondria, the nucleus, and the chloroplast. I also want you to be familiar with plant tissues. So tissues are similar cell types working together for a common function. So an example of a tissue in our bodies would be our fat tissue. So we've got a bunch of fat cells. Collectively, they help keep our body insulated and they help to cushion some of our organs. So it would be an example of a tissue. All those fat cells look pretty similar and they're all performing a similar function. So plants have tissues too. There are 2 different types of plant tissues. The tissues are either baby tissues or meristematic tissues, or they're non-meristematic or adult tissues. The meristematic tissues are made of dividing cells. So cells, when one cell becomes 2 cells, that's called cell division. And in plants, there's only a couple of places where that division is happening on a regular basis. It's happening in the very tips of the shoots and the very tips of the roots. And that division is how the plant grows. So that's how it grows up in order to intercept more sunlight, and it's how the roots grow down in order to find more nutrients and water in the soils. These are called apical meristems. So there's cell division going on in the tips of the shoots and in the tips of the roots. So these would be meristematic regions or areas where we have meristematic tissues in the plant body. Plants also have meristematic tissues in the stem. So this is a cross section of a stem, and there's a little cylinder. If the plant is a woody plant that's undergoing secondary growth, which means it's growing in girth, the stem is getting bigger, it's going to have meristematic tissues in the stem. So these are called lateral meristems. And this is how the cell division that's happening in the lateral meristems is how the plant stem gets wider. So we've got apical and lateral meristems. Those are the kinds of meristematic tissues in plants. And then we have non-meristematic, which are not dividing. And these are the adult tissues in the plant. So there are three types of adult tissues in plants. They're vascular, ground, and dermal tissues. This diagram here shows us the location of the adult tissues in the different plant organs. So in the leaf, we've got these little purple bundles, these little purple dots dispersed throughout the leaf. These are the vascular tissues. The vascular tissues in the stem are these little bundles that sort of almost form a cylinder in the stem. The vascular tissues in the root are all concentrated in the center. The ground tissue surrounds the vascular tissue. It is what's shown here in yellow, surrounding the single vascular bundle in the root, in the middle of the stem and also outside of the vascular bundles in the stem, and then it's also surrounding these vascular bundles in the leaf. Finally, on the outside of these organs, we've got the dermal tissue, which is shown in green here on the root, on the stem, and on the leaf. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the function of these adult tissues in plants. Vascular tissue includes two different kinds of tissues, xylem and phloem, and they're each made out of specialized cells. The main function of xylem tissue is to transport water from the roots of the plant up to the shoots. So the water is present in the soil, but remember, it's a requirement for photosynthesis. So that water has to get up to the leaves because that's where photosynthesis is occurring. Of course, those plant leaf cells also require water in order to maintain turgor pressure. So the xylem is what's moving water up from the roots of the plant to the shoot. So we see these xylem cells here. They're kind of like little straws. They're long cells that allow the plant to suck water up from the roots to the shoots. In this diagram, this would be a cross-section of a stem. We can see the xylem in the center of this little bundle, and then the phloem is on the outside of this bundle. Phloem is the vascular tissue that transports nutrients and organic molecules around the plant. So think about those leaves. They're working really hard. They're making a bunch of sugars. Those sugars are food that needs to feed all of the plant cells. So that sugar can get to other plant cells via the phloem. And you can see here the phloem is located on the outside of this vascular bundle in the stem. This diagram shows the direction of movement in the phloem going down. That's not always the case. The phloem is going to be flowing from wherever a source of organic matter and nutrients is to wherever they're needed around the plant body. So these tissues are transporting things around the plant body. In the case of xylem, they're transporting water. In the case of phloem, they're transporting nutrients and organic molecules. These are some micrographs to highlight the vascular tissues. Here you can see this is a vascular bundle, a close-up of a vascular bundle inside a stem. You can see that the cells are pretty large. They're also red because they have this really tough molecule in them called lignin. So these are lignified xylem cells. In addition to helping the plant transport substances around the body, these really tough cells in the xylem and the phloem also are important structurally. So they're really rigid. They give the plant strength and support. And as I mentioned, the xylem and the phloem, like we saw in the previous diagram, are often clustered together in these little bundles, which I'm trying to circle here on this diagram, where we've got the xylem, these red cells on the inside, and then phloem on the outside in the stem. Okay, the ground tissue is a little bit more simple than the vascular tissue. Remember, the ground tissue is shown in these diagrams in yellow. It can have different functions depending on where it is in the plant body. Ground tissue can serve the plant by conducting photosynthesis. That's primarily what the ground tissue that surrounds the vascular bundles in the leaf is going to be doing. Ground tissue can serve the plant by storing things like carbohydrates. So think about some of those really energy dense plant parts that we eat, like carrots and potatoes. Those are loaded up. Those are examples of organs that are loaded with ground tissue that's storing things like starch, molecules like starch, these high energy molecules. Ground tissue can also provide flexible or rigid support for the plant. I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. And the meristematic regions of the plant, there will be some cell division going on. In the adult region, the adult tissues, some of these tissues can maintain the ability to divide if there's some kind of injury. So if there's a cut in the stem, it's possible that these ground tissues, even though they're adult tissues, could be stimulated to divide in order to heal that wound. So those are some of the diverse functions of the ground tissue. And these are just some images. So here we see photosynthetic cells, ground tissue cells within a leaf. You can see these, they're loaded up with chloroplasts. That's these tiny disc-shaped structures within these cells. And then they can also, ground tissue can also be, as I mentioned, supportive. These cells, which you see here in the outside of the stem, just under the dermal tissue, are parenchyma cells. They're a little bit tougher. They have slightly thicker cell walls than these parenchyma cells in the center of the stem, so they can provide a little bit of structure, a little bit of support for the plant. And then these would be parenchyma cells on the inside of the stem, which could be used to store things like carbohydrates that can be used for energy. Finally, the third kind of adult tissue in plants is dermal tissue. And as I mentioned, this forms the outer covering of the plant body. So this is a micrograph of a plant leaf, and the dermal tissue would be these cells that are on the very outside edge of that leaf. It includes epidermal cells, so these would be epidermal cells. These would be epidermal cells. It also includes cells called guard cells, which surround the stomata. Remember, we talked about a stoma is a little opening in the plant leaf that can allow gases like CO2 and oxygen to get into or out of the plant cell. there are little cells here called guard cells that control whether that pore is open or closed. So the plant can control when gas exchange is occurring. Dermal tissues can also include little hairs called trichomes, which can be useful in preventing herbivores from chewing on the leaf. So if there's little hairs, sometimes that can deter things from feeding on the plant. Those little hairs can also sometimes help the plant maintain water inside the leaf. And the function of the dermal tissue, the functions are diverse. They help to separate the plant from its environment so that the plant can, maintain certain amounts of gases and humidity inside the leaf or the stem or the root. They can prevent water loss, which is especially important in the leaves. As I mentioned, things like trichomes can protect the plant from herbivores. The dermal tissue can also protect the plant from invasion by disease-causing microbes like fungi or bacteria. And in the roots, there are root hairs that are part of the dermal tissue that help to increase the surface area of the root and allow it to absorb more water. So there's a diverse array of functions of the dermal tissue in plants. Okay, now I want to take a closer look at some of the plant organs. So an organ is part of an organism that is self-contained, has more than one tissue type, and a specific function. So you've got a bunch of organisms. One of them would be your stomach. So it's this little self-contained sac that's got vascular tissue, it's got epithelial tissue, and it's helping you digest your food. The plant organs are the leaves, the stem, and the roots, where the leaf is the main photosynthetic organ. So that's where plants are collecting solar energy and they're converting it to carbohydrates. The main function of the stem is to support those leaves, so to hold them up so that they're maximizing their interception of sunlight. And in some cases, the stem is going to be also supporting reproductive organisms. The stem is also helping to conduct water. So water's coming up from the roots. It's helping to get that water to the leaves. The stem is also going to help the plant conduct photosynthate around the plant body. Photosynthate are things like carbohydrates. So the stem is important for support and also conduction. And then finally, the third organ of the plant body is the roots, which we see down here. And the roots are going to play a role in anchorage, so helping to keep the plant anchored into the ground so it doesn't get washed away. They're going to be important in absorption, so roots are going to be absorbing both water and nutrients out of the soil. And in some cases, some roots are going to store energy for the plant. So think about things like roots like a carrot or a parsnip. Those are loaded with energy so that the plant can store that energy over winter in the root and then use it the next year to support plant growth. Organ systems are groups of organs working together. For example, I said that your stomach is an example of an organ in your body. The organ system that it's a part of is the digestive system. Plants have just two organ systems. They have what's called a shoot system, and then they have a root system. So the shoot system is everything that's shown in green up here. So it's going to include the stems, the leaves, and the reproductive organs. We'll talk more about reproductive organs in the future, plant reproductive organs in the future. The shoot system is usually above ground, although not always. There are some examples of stems and reproductive organs that are found underground, but it's generally above ground. The function of the shoot system is going to be similar to the functions of the stems and the leaves that we just talked about. It's elevating the plant above the soil. The shoot system's primary function is going to be photosynthesis, also reproduction and the dispersal of offspring, and conduction of materials around the plant body. The root system in this diagram is everything that we see here in brown. So the root system includes the organ, the roots. It's usually going to be below ground, although there are some examples of roots that we see sometimes above ground. And the functions of the root system are going to be the same functions that we just discussed for the roots: anchoring, absorption, storage, and finally conduction. So, in summary, you should know the main feature of the plant cells. You should know that these are eukaryotic cells, and you should be particularly familiar with the features of the plant cell that distinguish them from animal cells. So that would include things like the chloroplast, the central vacuole, the plant cell wall. You should know the difference between the meristematic or the baby tissues and the adult plant tissues. The meristematic are young tissues. There's a lot of cell division going on within the meristematic regions of the plants. The adult tissues have diverse functions. They include the dermal tissue, the ground tissue, and the vascular tissue. You should know the locations and the functions of each of those three kinds of adult plant tissues. You should be familiar with the plant organs, the leaf, the stem, and the roots. You should know their functions and also the structure and functions of the plant organ systems, the root system and the shoot system. Thanks for listening.